The first thing you have to understand is that this house breathes. It's not a haunting, not in the spooky sense, but the kind of living presence you only get from 200 years of births, deaths, and quiet Sunday afternoons soaking up the New England sun. Every morning, I'd come downstairs and the wide plank floorboards would offer their familiar chorus of groans and creaks, like an old man stretching his bones. I'd make my way to the kitchen, where the morning light slants through the wavy, original glass of the window panes, distorting the view of the garden just enough to make it look like a watercolor painting. Eleanor, my late wife, had loved that effect. She used to say it was the house's way of reminding us that the past is never as clear as we think. I'd make 2 cups of tea, same as I always have. One for me, black with a slice of lemon, and one for her, Earl Grey with milk and a half spoon of sugar. I'd set hers down on the small table by the hearth, right next to her worn leather armchair. The chair still holds the faint impression of her form, a gentle dip in the cushion that my mind fills in every morning. I know she's gone, of course I do. But the ritual feels like a conversation, a quiet acknowledgement that the history we built together still echoes in these rooms. This house is an archive of our love, and I am its last faithful curator. After my tea, my day would truly begin in the library. It's my favorite room, smelling of old paper, lemon oil, and leather-bound books. This is where I did my life's work, both as a teacher and as the unofficial town historian. Piled on the great oak desk were my current projects, transcribing letters from a Portsmouth sea captain from 1820 and restoring a series of land deeds that showed how this town grew, family by family, acre by acre. My own family's deed, signed in 1798, hung framed on the wall. It was a direct link to the past, a promise made by my ancestors that I felt a duty to uphold. On the corner of the desk, propped up against a stack of books, was a photo of my daughter, Jess. It was from her college graduation. She was brilliant, full of fire and ambition. I was so proud. I still am, of course. A father's love doesn't just switch off. In the picture, she has her arm around me, and we're both smiling, a genuine, uncomplicated smile. That was before she met Kyle, before her life became a series of curated posts and brand partnerships, before her visits started feeling less like a daughter coming home and more like a CEO inspecting a charming but underperforming asset. I'd trace the frame with my finger, sending a silent message across the miles. "Just call your old man, sweetie. Let me hear your voice." And soon she would. As if I had summoned her, the soft chime of a video call echoed from the old desktop computer I kept tucked in the corner of the library. It was a sound that always felt alien in this house, a digital bird call in an ancient forest. I walked over, my heart giving a familiar, hopeful leap, and clicked the green icon. Her face, flawlessly framed and lit, filled the screen. She was in a hotel room, but you wouldn't know it. The background was a symphony of beige and white, so minimalist and perfect it looked less like a room and more like a high-end catalog. "Daddy, hi!" Jess's smile was bright, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the same practiced, engaging smile she used in her sponsored posts for organic toothpaste and sustainable activewear. "I was just thinking about you. How are you? Is the old place still standing?" I chuckled, settling into my worn office chair. "Still standing, sweetie. Been standing for a couple of centuries. I think it can handle a few more. It's good to see your face. How's the trip?" "Oh, it's been absolutely amazing," she said, her voice shifting into its public, performative gear. "The content we're getting here is just next level. Yesterday we did a collab with this artisanal coffee brand, and the aesthetic was just perfect. Kyle is networking like crazy. He thinks he's close to landing some major seed funding." She paused, her eyes flicking for a fraction of a second to her own image on the screen before returning to me. "But enough about that. Are you eating right? I saw a new meal delivery service that does organic, senior-focused wellness boxes. I can sign you up." The offer was meant to sound caring, I know, but it felt like I was another item on her to-do list, a problem to be solved with a subscription. "I'm managing just fine, Jess. Making your mother's pot roast tonight, in fact." I tried to steer the conversation back to something real, something connecting us. "Remember how you used to love helping her in the kitchen?" A flicker of something annoyance, impatience, crossed her face before the smile was back in place. "Of course. So sweet." She glanced at something off-screen. "Listen, Dad, I have to run. We have a dinner with some potential investors, and I have to get my energy right." but I just wanted to see you and say I love you. I love you too, sweetie. More than you know. Talk soon, she chirped, and then her image vanished as she minimized the window. The screen went dark, and I sighed, the familiar feeling of a too short, too shallow conversation settling in. I reached for the mouse to end the call, but before my hand got there, I heard it. The connection, the audio, was still live. And then I heard a different voice. Kyle's voice, laced with an ugly, dismissive tone I'd never heard him use before. Is he off? Kyle asked. My hand, poised to click the mouse, froze midair. The library, my sanctuary of quiet history, suddenly felt like a courtroom where I was the unknowing defendant. The air grew thick and cold. I leaned closer to the speakers, every nerve in my body screaming at me to disconnect, to run from whatever was coming, but I was paralyzed. Is he off? Kyle asked. Yeah, he's gone, Jess replied, her voice losing its bright, sugary coating and dropping into a flat, weary tone. He bought the whole wellness box thing. God, it's exhausting. A sound of disgust came from Kyle. Exhausting is watching that prime real estate just sit there, Jess. We're bleeding money, and he's just rattling around in that valuable property like a ghost. I had a guy from a Boston firm do a quiet appraisal. With the historical grants attached, that place could pull in 1.2, maybe 1.3 million. That's not just seed funding, that's the whole damn company. My own breath caught in my throat. My house, Eleanor's garden, the library, the nursery where I rocked Jess to sleep, reduced to a number in a real estate calculation. I felt a tremor start in my hands, a deep, seismic shock that seemed to run from the floorboards straight into my bones. I know, Kyle. I know, Jess sighed. But what can we do? He'll never agree to sell. His whole identity is tied up in that dusty old museum. That's the point. Kyle's voice was sharp, clinical. His identity is becoming a drag on our brand. He's an anchor, Jess. We need to be lean, agile, thinking about the future, and we're tethered to this ancestor worship. We can't build an empire if our capital is tied up in his nostalgia. A drag on the brand. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't her father. I was a branding problem. I sank back in my chair, the worn leather groaning in the silence. All the warmth I'd felt just moments before had evaporated, replaced by an icy void. Jess was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, I held onto a desperate, foolish sliver of hope that she would defend me. That my daughter, my brilliant girl, would push back. But then she spoke, and the foundation of my world finally crumbled. So, the lawyer you talked to, she said, her voice now a conspiratorial whisper. The power of attorney thing. You're sure it would work? Positive, Kyle said, full of confidence. We build a case, we document his forgetfulness, his isolation. We frame it as a loving, responsible decision. We're not abandoning him, we're upgrading him. We find one of those chic, minimalist assisted living places. Great design, good amenities. We can even spin it on your socials. Ensuring my father's golden years are as beautiful and curated as his life has been. People will love it. It's authentic. Authentic. The word was a poison dart. I looked around the library at the tangible, solid proof of my life, of my parents' lives, of my love for Eleanor. This was real. This was authentic. What they were planning, it was a theft. A theft of my home, my legacy, and my very personhood, all wrapped in the empty, stylish language of their world. Okay, Jess said, her voice firm now, convinced. Okay. When we get back, we start the process. The line finally went dead. The connection was severed, leaving a profound and terrible silence in its wake. I sat there, motionless, staring at the blank computer screen. The house was still breathing around me, but for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger within its walls. They weren't just planning to sell my home, they were planning to erase me from it. For how long I sat there, I can't say. Time had lost its meaning, stretching and compressing in the profound silence of the library. The only sound was the frantic, panicked thumping in my own chest. Eventually, a deep, primal need to move took over. I couldn't stay in that room, with the ghost of my daughter's voice still hanging in the air. I pushed myself up from the chair, my body feeling ancient and heavy, as if gravity had suddenly doubled its hold on me. My legs felt unsteady as I walked out of the library and into the central hallway, beginning a pilgrimage through my own life. My hand found the banister, the wood worn smooth and glossy from generations of hands, including my own. My fingers traced the familiar grain, and for a second I wasn't a 7-2-year-old man, but a young father again, watching a giggling 7-year-old Jess slide down this very railing on a dare, her pigtails flying behind her. The memory of her laughter, a sound I treasured more than anything, now echoed as a cruel mockery. How could that joyful, fearless little girl have grown into the cold, calculating stranger I'd just heard on the phone? The grand old clock at the foot of the stairs, a wedding gift from Eleanor's parents, ticked on, each beat measuring out the seconds of my new, shattered reality. It had marked the time of our family's joys and sorrows for 50 years. Now, it seemed to be counting down to an execution. I drifted into the living room, the heart of the house. My eyes fell on the great fieldstone fireplace, the mantel above it a ledger of our family's history. I ran my thumb over a small crescent-shaped gouge in the oak. Christmas, 1995. Jess, clumsy with excitement, had dropped a heavy snow globe. I remembered Eleanor kneeling, comforting a crying Jess, telling her that the mark wasn't a flaw, but a memory. "Now we'll always remember the Christmas of the great snow globe avalanche," she'd said, her voice full of grace. Our whole life was written in the language of these imperfections. They were trying to sell these stories, to liquidate these memories and call it an upgrade. My gaze moved to Eleanor's armchair by the hearth, the one where I still placed her morning tea. This was where we'd sit on cold winter nights, the fire crackling, planning the future. We planned for Jess's college education, for her travels, for her wedding. We sacrificed for it. We took out a second mortgage to pay for her tuition at that expensive private university she had her heart set on, eating beans and rice for months to make it work. We never saw it as a burden. We saw it as building her future, brick by brick, just as my grandfather had built this house. And now, my daughter and her husband were planning to tear it all down to fund a tech startup and polish their brand. The irony was so bitter, it felt like poison on my tongue. The kitchen, usually a place of comfort, felt cold and hollow. The air still held the faint, spicy scent of the pot roast I'd been preparing to make. Now, the thought of eating felt obscene. I saw the ghost of a younger Eleanor at the counter, her hands dusted with flour, patiently showing a tiny Jess how to crimp the edges of a pie crust. I could almost feel the warmth from the oven, hear Eleanor's gentle instructions, see the look of intense concentration on Jess's little face. "You have a baker's touch, my love," Eleanor had told her. Where was that girl now? When had her hands, once so skilled at creating, learned only how to take? Slowly, I made my way upstairs, each step a monumental effort. I passed Jess's old bedroom and pushed the door open. It was mostly a guest room now, but on the inside of the closet door, the growth chart we'd kept was still there. A series of pencil marks and dates, tracking her journey from a small child to a young woman, all within these walls. Jessica, age 10. Jessica, age 16. Taller than Mom. I touched the highest mark, my fingers trembling. I had stood in this very spot and held her when she had nightmares. I had sat on the edge of her bed and helped her with homework. I had promised her, silently and fiercely, every single day, that I would always protect her, and all along, perhaps the one I needed to protect her from was herself. Finally, I entered the master bedroom, our room. The air was still and sacred. Her side of the bed was perfectly made, her reading glasses folded on the nightstand next to a book she'd never finish. This was the room where she had fought her hardest, and where she had finally found her peace. I walked to the window overlooking her garden, the roses just beginning to bloom. It was near the end, her voice was a fragile whisper, and she had grabbed my hand with a surprising strength. "Frank," she'd said, her eyes clear and focused, "you're too good, your heart is too soft. Promise me you won't let anyone take advantage of you when I'm gone. You take care of yourself." I'd promised. "Always, Eleanor, I promise." Standing there, with the ghost of her final words wrapping around me, the profound, gut-wrenching grief began to change. It started to cool, to harden. The anguish was still there, a great gaping wound in my soul. But something else was beginning to form in its place. A cold, hard resolve. A promise to be kept. My daughter and her husband saw me as a confused old man, a dusty relic to be cleared away. They had forgotten who I was. I was a historian. I understood that history is not just something you read. It is a battle over who gets to tell the story, and I would not let them be the ones to write my final chapter. Eleanor's words, her final prescient warning, echoed in the quiet bedroom. They were not a ghost's whisper, but a call to arms. The paralysis of shock and the heavy cloak of grief began to recede, replaced by a cold, clarifying fire. I walked out of the bedroom, my steps no longer shuffling with the weight of a victim, but measured and deliberate. I knew where I had to go. Back to the library, back to the scene of the crime. But this time, I wasn't entering as a wounded old man. I was entering as a historian, and it was time to consult the archives. My library is not just a collection of books about the dead. It's a meticulously organized record of a life. My life. Eleanor's, Jess's. I bypassed the town records and went straight to the tall wooden filing cabinet in the corner where we kept our personal history. I pulled open a drawer labeled 1998 to 2005, and my fingers, steady now, found what I was looking for. A thick photo album bound in blue leather. I opened it on the great oak desk, the same desk where I taught Jess her letters, and the first photograph stared up at me. Jess on her high school graduation day, cap askew, diploma clutched in her hand, her face alight with the fierce, untamed promise of youth. I remembered that day. I remembered the pride that made my chest feel too small for my heart, and I remembered the conversation a week later, her sitting right here on the edge of this desk, her eyes pleading. She didn't want to go to the state university. She'd been accepted to a prestigious and ruinously expensive art and design college in New York. "It's my dream, Dad," she'd said. "It's where I can become who I'm meant to be." Eleanor and I had stayed up all night, our voices low, the numbers spread out on the kitchen table looking like an invading army. I found my journal from that year, the pages thin and soft with age. My own handwriting from a lifetime ago looked back at me. The 12th of October, 2001. Ellie and I made the decision tonight. We're taking out the second mortgage. It will be tight for the next 15 years, but when I see the light in Jessica's eyes when she talks about her future, I know it's the only choice. What is this house for, if not to build a foundation for her dreams? She is our greatest work, our legacy. A foundation for her dreams. The words mocked me. I had leveraged our past to build her future, and now she saw that very foundation as a cash machine for her curated lifestyle. The sacrifice, the years of scrimping and saving, the sleepless nights worrying about payments, all of it erased, devalued into a dusty old museum that was a drag on the brand. A cold fury, clean and sharp as glass, began to replace the grief. I put the journal aside and pulled out another album, this one from her mid-20s. There she was, holding her first professional camera, a gift from us for her 25th birthday. This was the beginning of her influencer career, before it was even called that. She wanted to be a travel blogger, to build an online portfolio. She needed equipment, a website, money to travel for that initial content. I went to the filing cabinet again and pulled out the bank statements from 2009. There it was, a withdrawal of $40,000. A significant portion of my retirement savings, given to her as an investment in her future. This was the money that bought the cameras, the lighting, the laptop. This was the seed money for the very brand that I was now, apparently, tarnishing with my existence. I had literally paid to create the monster that was now devouring me. The last piece of evidence was the hardest. I found their wedding album, Jess and Kyle, smiling under the great oak tree in the backyard. Kyle, so charming, so confident, his arm draped around my daughter. He looked like the man I had hoped Jess would find. He was, in fact, a smiling predator. I remembered the phone call 3 years ago, long after the wedding glow had faded. Jess was sobbing, incoherent. Kyle's latest can't-miss tech venture had collapsed, leaving a mountain of debt. They were about to be evicted. Eleanor was gone by then, and I was alone. I did what any father would do. I drained my emergency fund, the money Eleanor and I had painstakingly saved for a crisis. $25,000, wired to his account to make the problem go away. He'd called me later, his voice slick with practiced gratitude. "Frank, you're a lifesaver. I'll pay you back every penny, I swear." I never saw a dime. I closed the final album. The soft thud of the leather cover echoed in the silent room. It was the sound of a door closing. The ledger was complete. This wasn't a single, sudden act of cruelty. This was a pattern, a long, slow, methodical draining of my resources, my love, and my life, all to fuel their insatiable ambition and vanity. The love I felt for the girl in the photographs was still there, a phantom limb that ached with a dull, constant pain. But it was now eclipsed by the righteous, burning anger I felt toward the woman she had become. I looked at their smiling wedding photo one last time. They looked so happy, so confident. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a soft-hearted old historian. They were about to meet the archivist of their downfall. The anger did not burn hot and reckless. It burned with a low, steady flame that brought a strange and total clarity. I stood in my library, the scattered albums and journals on the desk looking like the aftermath of a forensic investigation. My investigation. The evidence was irrefutable, the pattern of behavior undeniable. For years, I had viewed my life as a father through the lens of love and nostalgia. Now, for the first time, I was looking at it as a historian. And a historian knows that you cannot change the past, but you can, and you must, control its narrative. My daughter and her husband were planning a hostile takeover of my life. They saw this house, my history, as a resource to be plundered. They saw me as a relic to be managed and discarded. Their strategy was based on a single, flawed assumption that I was a weak, sentimental old fool. It was time to write a new chapter, one where the old man they underestimated became the architect of their consequences. A historian, after all, is a strategist by nature. You learn to analyze your assets, understand the terrain, and anticipate your opponent's moves. My greatest asset wasn't the money locked within these walls, it was the history itself. And my opponent's greatest weakness was that they didn't understand its true value. My mind, which had been clouded by grief for 2 years, was now a sharp, well-ordered instrument. I knew I couldn't fight them with emotion. I had to fight them on my own terms, using my own expertise. I walked over to the bookshelf that housed my collection on New England architectural history. I pulled down a heavy volume, Preserving Portsmouth, A Legacy in Timber and Stone. Tucked inside the front cover, where I'd left it years ago after a historical society fundraiser, was a business card. It was made of thick, creamy cardstock, the letters embossed, not printed. It didn't belong to a slick, fast-talking real estate agent. It read, Arthur Prentice & Sons, historical property consultants specializing in the preservation and placement of New England's heritage homes since 1968. I remembered Arthur, an older gentleman like me with a passion for history etched into the lines on his face. He'd given a lecture on the importance of placing historical homes with custodians, not just buyers. He spoke of legacy, of continuity, of honor. He was an ally who would understand that this was not a real estate transaction. This was a rescue mission. I picked up the old rotary phone on my desk, the one Jess always joked I should replace. Its weight felt solid and real in my hand. I stared at the wedding photograph of her and Kyle, their bright, predatory smiles beaming up at me. They were planning to use lawyers and doctors to build a false narrative of my decline. They were coming with documents and deception. Well, I was a man of documents, too. And my history was longer, my foundation stronger, and my resolve harder than they could possibly imagine. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up Arthur Prentice's card and began to dial the number. The campaign had begun. The phone only rang twice before a calm, steady voice answered. Prentice. Arthur, my name is Frank Miller. I'm not sure if you'll remember me. We met several years ago at the Portsmouth Historical Society lecture on Federal Period architecture. There was a brief, thoughtful pause on the other end. The Miller House on Chestnut Street. Of course I remember. Original 1798 joinery in the West Parlor and one of the finest collections of colonial shipping ledgers in the state. I remember it well. What can I do for you, Frank? The fact that he remembered the house before he remembered me sent a wave of relief through my body. This was the right man. Arthur, I find myself in a delicate situation regarding the future of the property. I need advice from someone who understands its true value. Is there any chance we could meet? It's a matter of some urgency. I'll be there in an hour, he said, without a moment's hesitation. An hour later, Arthur Prentice stood in my library. He was exactly as I remembered, a man in his late 70s with a tweed jacket, kind, intelligent eyes, and the quiet, observant demeanor of a scholar. He didn't look at me at first. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the hand-hewn beams overhead, the faint, sweet smell of aging paper. He was reading the room, understanding its history before we even spoke. It's even better than I remembered, he said softly, running a gentle hand over the spine of a leather-bound book, a living piece of history. Now, Frank, you said this was urgent. I poured him a cup of tea, my hands now moving with a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't pour out the whole sordid, emotional story. A strategist doesn't reveal his entire hand. Instead, I presented the situation with the cool detachment of a historian outlining a conflict. My daughter and her husband have modern ideas for the property's future, I began, choosing my words carefully. Ideas that do not align with its preservation. They have come to believe that I am no longer capable of managing the estate and are preparing to take legal steps to assume control. Arthur listened, his expression unchanging, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, weary recognition. He had seen this battle before. The eternal war between legacy and greed. They think you're a confused old man, he stated, not as a question, but as a sad fact. That is the narrative they intend to construct, I confirmed. And they see this place, he gestured around the room, not as a treasure, but as an asset to be liquidated. That is the precise term their generation prefers, I said, a bitter edge to my voice. Arthur fell silent, looking out the window at Eleanor's garden. His jaw was set in a firm, angry line. He was offended not just on my behalf, but on behalf of the house itself. This is more than a house, Frank. It's a landmark. Your family has been its faithful custodian for over 2 centuries. To see it treated as a line item on a spreadsheet is an abomination. He turned back to me, his eyes sharp with intent. You came to me for advice. Here it is. We don't just defend, we attack. But we do it quietly, quickly, and decisively. My heart, which had felt like a cold stone in my chest, began to beat with a steady, hopeful rhythm. What do you have in mind? Your children will get a market rate appraisal from some flashy commercial realtor who sees square footage and granite countertops. They'll value this place at maybe $900,000, $1 million if they're generous. They are fools, Arthur said with a dismissive wave of his hand. They don't understand what's here. I work closely with the New England Preservation Trust. They are not developers, they are guardians. And for a property like this perfectly preserved, with its original archives intact, they would pay a significant premium. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. We can get you an all-cash offer for at least $1.2 million. We can have the paperwork drawn up in 2 days and close within 10. No inspections, no negotiations, and it would be a private sale. By the time your children find out, the deed will be signed, the money will be in your account, and the house will be protected in perpetuity. The plan was more perfect, more elegant than anything I could have devised on my own. It wasn't just an escape, it was a checkmate. I would not only secure my freedom, but I would also fulfill my ultimate duty as a historian. I would save the history. I would protect my home forever from the very person I had built it for. I stood up and extended my hand. Arthur, I said, my voice steady and clear for the first time in days. Let's get to work. The days that followed were a quiet flurry of activity. Arthur Prentice was a man of his word. Appraisers from the trust came and went, their movements as discreet as ghosts. Contracts were drafted with the speed and precision of a military operation. All the while, I moved through my house, not as its owner, but as its archivist, carefully boxing the irreplaceable items. Eleanor's letters, my research, the tintype photographs of ancestors, whose names only I remembered. I was preparing for an evacuation. And in the midst of it all, 4 days after my meeting with Arthur, the phone rang again. It was Jess. My heart didn't leap this time. It settled into a low, steady beat, like a drummer before a battle. It was time to perform. I picked up the receiver, intentionally letting a slight, frail tremor enter my voice. Hello? Dad, it's me. Her voice was a cascade of bright, artificial cheer. How are you feeling? I was worried when we didn't talk for a few days. Worried your asset might be having second thoughts, I thought. But what I said was, oh, Jess, sweetie, it's so good to hear you. I've just been a little tired is all. Old bones, you know. This was the role they had cast for me, and I would play it to perfection. That's exactly why I'm calling, she said, her tone softening into one of deep, feigned concern. Kyle and I have been doing a lot of thinking, and we've decided you've earned a real vacation. A long one. We found this incredible place up in the mountains. It's more like a wellness retreat. Chefs, beautiful scenery, activities, and there's medical staff right there, just in case. We want to treat you. A wellness retreat. A prison coded in the language of a luxury spa. The audacity of it was breathtaking. I felt the cold anger coiling in my gut, but I let none of it touch my voice. Instead, I let out a soft, wavering sigh of what sounded like relief. Oh, Jess, a resort? For me? I don't know what to say. You two are just so good to your old dad. We just want you to be in a low-stress environment, Dad, she said. the condescending therapeutic jargon flowing effortlessly. We'll handle all the logistics. You just need to pack a small bag with your essentials. This was my moment, the intelligence gathering. That sounds just wonderful, I said, infusing my voice with a touch of elderly confusion. My old head gets the details all mixed up these days. So I can be ready. Remind me, what day do you get back home? We land next Friday, she said, a note of triumph in her voice. She thought she was leading me right into the cage. Our flight gets in around 3, so we'll probably be at the house by 5 o'clock to pick you up. Does that sound okay? Friday at 5. The timeline was set, the final piece of the puzzle. That sounds perfect, sweetie, I said, my voice thick with manufactured gratitude. I'll be waiting right here for you. It'll be so good to see you both. We can't wait to see you too, Dad. Get some rest. We love you. I love you, I said, and the words felt like gravel in my mouth. The moment I heard the click of her hanging up, the frail, grateful old man vanished. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a firm, steady hand. The performance was over. My face was a cold, emotionless mask. I turned and immediately picked up the receiver again, dialing Arthur Prentice's direct line. He answered on the first ring. Arthur, it's Frank, I said, my voice now crisp and clear, stripped of all pretense. We have a firm timeline. The enemy makes landfall next Friday at 1700 hours. That gives us exactly 6 days to close the deal and vacate the premises. The next 6 days were the strangest of my life. The house, which had always been a sanctuary of living memory, transformed into a silent, organized repository awaiting transfer. It was no longer my home. It was a project, the final and most important archival task of my career. The clock was ticking, each tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall a reminder of the approaching deadline. There was no time for grief. There was only the mission. On Tuesday morning, 2 days after my call, Arthur Prentice arrived, accompanied by a quiet, professional woman from the New England Preservation Trust. We sat in the library, not as a family in a home, but as representatives in a boardroom. The documents were spread across the great oak desk. They were simple, elegant, and ironclad. A single page outlined the sale price, $1.2 million, and the transfer of the deed. A second, more detailed document was a preservation covenant, a legally binding promise that the house and its historical contents would be maintained in perpetuity. This was Arthur's masterstroke. I wasn't just selling the house, I was legally binding its new owners to protect it in a way my own blood had refused to. I picked up the pen. For a moment, my eyes drifted to the framed deed on the wall, the one signed by my great-great-great-grandfather in 1798. I was the last Miller to hold this title. A wave of profound ancestral sorrow washed over me. I was breaking a chain that had held for over 2 centuries. But then I looked at the covenant, at the promise of protection, and I knew I wasn't breaking the chain. I was forging its final, strongest link. My hand was firm as I signed my name. It was done. A quiet congratulations was offered, a bank wire was confirmed, and just like that, I was a visitor in my own life. Then came the real work. The methodical, heart-wrenching task of separating the soul of the house from its body. I began in the master bedroom. I went to Eleanor's closet, the scent of lavender and cedar still clinging to her clothes. I didn't pack the dresses or the coats. I simply took the small, embroidered sachet of lavender from her drawer and a single, well-worn silk scarf. From her nightstand, I took her reading glasses and the novel she would never finish, its pages still holding her place. I carefully wrapped her simple, elegant jewelry box in soft velvet cloth. These were not valuables, they were relics. In the library, I worked like a true archivist. I didn't throw things into boxes. I carefully wrapped the colonial shipping ledgers in acid-free paper. I cataloged my research notes, the product of 40 years of passion. I placed my family's journals and deeds into a climate-controlled archival box that Arthur had provided. This was my life's work. This was the history they had dismissed as dusty. The photo albums were the hardest part. I went through each one, my heart aching with every turned page. The album from my wedding to Eleanor, I packed. The ones showing Jess as a baby, taking her first steps in the kitchen, I packed. But when I got to the albums from her teenage years, her college graduation, her lavish wedding to Kyle, the life I had funded with a second mortgage, and my retirement savings, I stopped. I looked at the glossy photos of the smiling, entitled woman she had become and the slick, charming man who had helped poison her mind. With a quiet, final resolve, I closed the album and left it on the shelf. That part of her history no longer belonged to me. I left everything else. The beautiful mahogany dining table where we'd hosted decades of Thanksgiving dinners. The four-poster bed Eleanor and I had shared. The comfortable sofas, the antique rugs, the grandfather clock. I left it all. They had coveted the things, the assets, the furniture. They had calculated its value, so I would leave it for them. An empty, beautifully furnished museum, stripped of every ounce of its soul. By Thursday night, my work was done. I stood in the doorway of the library, looking at the 4 neatly labeled archival boxes that represented the entirety of my past. My true inheritance. The rest of the house stood silent and waiting, a perfect, hollow stage set for the final act. I had successfully decommissioned a life. All that was left was to disappear. Friday morning arrived with a cool, gray dawn. The day of the reckoning. My car, an old but reliable sedan, was packed with the 4 archival boxes that now constituted my entire world. I stood on the porch, the new, unfamiliar house key feeling foreign and heavy in my pocket. I took one last look at the home that had cradled my family for over 2 centuries. I didn't feel the sharp pang of grief I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound and somber finality, the way a historian feels upon closing the final page of a great, tragic book. The story was written. It was time to leave the library. I got in my car, turned the key in the ignition, and drove away without looking back. My new life was located in a building called Riverbend Lofts, a name so generic it was practically anonymous. It was a modern, glass and steel structure on the edge of town, a place with no history, no ghosts, no soul. The furnished 1-bedroom apartment I'd rented was on the 4th floor. When I opened the door, I was hit by the sterile smell of new paint and industrial carpet cleaner. The furniture was sleek, gray, and uncomfortable, chosen from a catalog for its complete lack of personality. The walls were a stark, unforgiving white. The only sound was the low, electric hum of the refrigerator. I carried my 4 boxes inside, placing them in the center of the living room. They looked like ancient, sacred artifacts that had been mistakenly delivered to a spaceship. The contrast was so jarring it was almost comical. There, in those boxes, was the story of the Miller family, the scent of wood smoke and old paper, the echoes of laughter and whispered secrets. And here, in this room, was nothing. A blank page. For a moment, a wave of intense dislocation washed over me. I was a man out of time, a historian with no context. But then I remembered my promise to Eleanor, and the cold resolve returned. This emptiness wasn't a loss, it was a tactical advantage. A ghost leaves no tracks. My next stop was the bank. Not my local branch, where I'd known the tellers by name for 40 years, but a large, impersonal commercial bank downtown. I walked in, feeling invisible in my simple coat, and asked to speak to the private wealth manager. A young, sharp-looking man in a tailored suit led me to a glass-walled office. He smiled a polite, professional smile, clearly wondering why this unassuming old man was taking up his time. Without a word, I slid the cashier's check from the New England Preservation Trust across his polished desk. His eyes widened as he read the name and the amount. The professional smile was replaced by a look of genuine, undisguised shock. $1,200,000, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at me with a newfound and profound respect. The transition was immediate and stark. I was no longer an old man. I was a man of substance. I was a client. For the next hour, I was no longer Frank Miller, the grieving widower. I was Franklin Miller, the account holder, a man making calculated decisions about his assets. I opened a new checking account, a new savings account, and a secure investment portfolio. I signed documents that severed the last financial threads connecting me to my old life. When I walked out of that bank, I held a new debit card in my wallet and a receipt in my pocket that confirmed my new reality. The number on it felt less like money and more like power. It was the power to be independent, the power to be free, the power to be a burden to no one, ever again. Back in the empty, silent apartment, I stood at the large picture window, looking out at the city lights beginning to sparkle as dusk settled. The 4 boxes sat behind me like faithful sentinels guarding my past. The blank white walls waited. The chapter of Frank Miller, custodian of the Miller house, was over. The chapter of Frank Miller, master of his own future, was about to begin, and I had everything I needed to write it. Friday afternoon, T-3 hours until they were due to arrive. I left the anonymous sanctuary of my new apartment and drove back towards Chestnut Street for the last time. There was no hesitation, no wave of nostalgia. I was no longer a man visiting his past. I was an operative returning to a secured location to make the final preparations. In the passenger seat sat a small, heavy toolbox and a shopping bag containing the last two pieces of my plan. My mind was perfectly calm, every action rehearsed, every detail accounted for. The historian had given way to the strategist, and the strategist was now the field agent. I parked a block away and walked to the house, letting myself in through the back door. The silence inside was different now. It was not the familiar, comfortable silence of home, but the inert, waiting silence of a stage before the actors arrive. I went straight to the front door, the beautiful, six-panel oak door my great-grandfather had installed. From my toolbox, I took out a brand-new, high-security deadbolt set. The brass was bright and gleaming, a stark contrast to the beautifully aged patina of the original 18th-century lock set. With the quiet competence of a man who had maintained this house his entire life, I began to work. I carefully unscrewed the antique hardware, the metal cool against my skin. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like a final, deliberate severing of a tie. I set the old lock set, with its heavy skeleton key, gently on the floor. It would be preserved by the trust, a piece of the home's history. Then, I fitted the new lock. It slid into place with a cold, modern precision. I drilled a new hole for the deadbolt, the sound of the drill unnaturally loud in the silent house. When I was done, I tested it. The bolt shot across with a sharp, definitive thud, a sound of absolute finality. This door would not be opened by them. Next, I opened the shopping bag. Inside was a small white device that looked like a carbon monoxide detector, the kind you plug directly into a wall outlet. It was, of course, nothing of the sort. It was a high-definition camera, Wi-Fi enabled, with a microphone sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from across the room. I had already set it up and tested it at the apartment, linking it to a new, untraceable smartphone I'd bought with cash. I plugged it into the outlet in the entryway, the one just beside the hall table. I checked the view on my phone. The angle was perfect. It captured the entire foyer, the foot of the stairs, and a clear, direct view of the front door. It would capture their faces, their reactions, every single word. The silent historian would now have a perfect, unbiased record of the event. Finally, the note. I had typed it the night before. There would be no shaky, emotional handwriting, no long, wounded explanations. My case was already made in the archives of my own memory. This was not a letter, it was a verdict. It was printed on a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper, the kind I used for official correspondence with historical societies. I had folded it once and placed it in a simple, white envelope. On the front, I had typed two words, Jessica and Kyle. I pulled the sheet from the envelope to read it one last time. If you are reading this, it means your key no longer fits the lock. It is not broken, it has been changed. I know you believe I am a confused old man, but my hearing is perfectly fine. I heard your conversation. I know of your plans to have me declared incompetent, to sell my home, and to place me in a facility. You referred to me as a drag on the brand. So, I have taken the liberty of managing my own affairs. This house, a registered historical landmark, has been sold to the New England Preservation Trust for $1.2 million. The funds are now in a new account at a new bank, where they are secure. My home's legacy is now legally protected in perpetuity, something you failed to value. Do not worry about me. I have found my own low-stress environment. Worry about yourselves. Consider this a final, practical lesson in the consequences of history. I refolded the paper, my hands steady. I slid it back into the envelope and sealed it. Using a single, precise piece of clear tape, I affixed it to the very center of the front door, at eye level. It hung there, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. My work was done. The locks were changed. The camera was active. The verdict was posted. I took one last, dispassionate look around the silent waiting room. Then I walked out the back door, locking it behind me, and drove away. The trap was set. All that was left was to watch. Back in my stark white apartment, I sat in the single, characterless armchair. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the room. It was 4:55 p.m. In my hand, I held my new smartphone, the screen alive with a silent, waiting image, the entryway of my former home. The view was crystal clear. I could see the polished wood of the hall table, the corner of the staircase, and, in the center of the frame, the dark oak of the front door with a small white rectangle taped to its surface. The stage was set. I was not nervous. I was a historian about to witness a primary source event unfold in real time. At 5:02 p.m., the first sign of their arrival was a subtle shift in the light, the sweep of headlights across the entryway windows. Then, through the sensitive microphone of the camera, I heard it. The crunch of gravel as a heavy vehicle turned into the driveway, followed by the clinical, electronic beep of a luxury SUV being locked. My fingers tightened on the phone. The curtain was rising. A moment later, they came into view, walking towards the front porch. They were a portrait of success. Kyle was in a tailored travel blazer, pushing his sunglasses up on his head, a confident smirk on his face. Jess was wearing an expensive, cream-colored linen pantsuit, looking radiant and relaxed, as if returning from a triumphant tour. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying an air of casual, untouchable victory. They looked like predators returning to a kill they'd left waiting. "God, I need a real drink," Kyle said, setting down two large, expensive-looking suitcases at the foot of the steps. That airport lounge wine was terrible. "First thing," Jess agreed, pulling the antique-looking brass key from her designer handbag. "I cannot wait to just collapse. I'll get the door." I leaned forward, my gaze fixed on the tiny screen. This was the moment, the first domino. She slid the key into the lock. It went in smoothly. She turned her wrist with the casual, thoughtless confidence of someone who has performed the action 10,000 times. Nothing happened. The lock didn't give. Her smile faltered, replaced by a small, impatient frown. "That's weird," she mumbled, jiggling the key. She pulled it out, examined it as if it had somehow betrayed her, and tried again. Still nothing. The door was a solid, unmoving wall. "What's wrong?" Kyle asked, his voice edged with irritation. "I don't know, it's stuck or something," Jess said, her frustration growing. "Dad probably bolted it from the inside and forgot." "He doesn't have a key to the bolt," Kyle snapped, his patience already gone. "Here, let me try. You're probably being too gentle." He took the key from her, strode to the door, and jammed it into the lock with force. He twisted his wrist hard. The old brass key, never meant for such aggression, bent with a sickening metallic groan. Kyle swore, pulling the now useless piece of metal from the lock. "What the hell? It's like the lock has been filled with cement." It was then, in their shared frustration, that Jess's eyes finally focused on the door itself, and she saw it. The stark white envelope. "Kyle, wait," she said, her voice suddenly small. "What is that?" Kyle followed her gaze, his angry expression shifting to one of confusion. He stepped closer and squinted. "Is that a note?" Jess slowly walked up the steps, an expression of profound unease settling on her perfectly made-up face. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and pulled the envelope from the door. She stared at the two typed words, Jessica and Kyle, as if it were a death sentence. She fumbled with the seal, her fingers suddenly clumsy, and pulled out the single sheet of paper. I watched their faces on the screen, the pixels capturing the precise moment their world shattered. I saw Jess's eyes scan the first few lines, her brow furrowed in confusion. Then, as she read on, the color drained from her face. Her mouth fell open in a silent O of disbelief. Her eyes widened in sheer, uncomprehending horror. A choked, guttural sound escaped her throat. Kyle snatched the note from her limp fingers. I watched his face go through its own rapid, ugly transformation, from impatience to cold, dawning realization, and then, as he reached the part about the $1, $2 million, to a mask of pure, incandescent rage. "No," Jess whispered, shaking her head. No, he couldn't, he wouldn't." "He did!" Kyle roared, the sound so loud it distorted the phone's speaker. He crumpled the note in his fist, his whole body trembling with fury. "The manipulative old bastard. He played us. He played us the entire time." Jess finally found her voice, and it rose into a hysterical, piercing shriek. "The house! He sold the house. My followers loved this house. It was part of my brand. The authentic, historical aesthetic. What am I supposed to do now?" She buried her face in her hands, her grief not for her father or her family home, but for her lost content, her shattered image. "Your brand?" Kyle spun on her, his face a grotesque mask of fury. "Are you listening to yourself? The brand? $1.2 million, Jess. That money was for my startup. That was our funding. That was our entire future. and he just gave it away to some dusty charity. "This is your fault!" Jess screamed back, tears streaming down her face, carving paths through her expensive foundation. "You pushed me. You're the one who kept saying he was a burden, a drag on the brand." "My fault?" Kyle laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I wasn't the one who was supposed to be the loving daughter. You were supposed to handle him, but you were too busy planning your next photo shoot to see that the confused old man was running circles around you." "He's a retired teacher. He shouldn't be this calculating," she wailed. "Well, he was a hell of a lot smarter than you, wasn't he?" Kyle shot back, gesturing wildly at the house that was no longer theirs. "Look at us. We're homeless. Our lease is up next week. What was your plan for that, Jess? Did you have a sponsored post lined up for that?" The venom in his voice was palpable. Their carefully constructed partnership, built on a foundation of shared greed, was crumbling to dust right there on the lawn. They screamed at each other for 10 more minutes, the accusations growing more personal and vicious, their beautiful, successful life exposed as a fragile, hollow sham. Finally, they exhausted themselves into a tense, defeated silence. Kyle stood staring at the house with a look of pure, impotent hatred. Jess had slumped onto one of her suitcases, her stylish pantsuit now wrinkled and stained with tears, her sobs the only sound in the quiet evening air. They were utterly broken. The reckoning was complete. In my quiet, anonymous apartment, I watched them for a moment longer. I felt no joy, no triumphant glee. I simply felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a historian who has seen the arc of events reach its just and inevitable conclusion. I had recorded the event. The historical record was now complete. I calmly pressed the power button on the side of the phone. The screen went black. I had seen enough. The screen on the phone went black, plunging the room into the quiet twilight. The drama was over. There was no elation, no surge of victorious adrenaline. There was only a profound and bottomless quiet. The ugly, frantic noise of their collapsed world was gone, replaced by the gentle hum of my new, anonymous life. The reckoning was complete, and I found I had no more space for them in my thoughts. They were a chapter of history I had finished documenting, a chapter I could now close for good. I calmly stood up and walked to the small kitchen counter. I took the new smartphone, the instrument of my victory, and placed it in a drawer, shutting it firmly. Its purpose was served. It was a tool for a conflict that was now over. Then, I turned to the 4 archival boxes that sat like silent, faithful sentinels in the center of the room. They held my real life, my true inheritance. I knelt and opened the one marked Portsmouth Archives, Miller Collection. The familiar, comforting scent of old paper and history washed over me, a scent I realized I had been missing more than I knew. I reached inside and carefully lifted out a rolled-up piece of parchment. I walked over to the soulless modern dining table and gently unrolled it beneath the light. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn map of Portsmouth from 1880, showing the winding streets and harbor I knew so well, every property line and family name sketched with a cartographer's loving precision. I leaned over the map, my fingers tracing the faint, spidery lines of the past. Outside my window, the city glittered with lights, a world of noise and ambition. But in here, there was only the quiet, steady passage of time. The ghosts in my old house had been laid to rest, its legacy secured. The angry, wounded man I had been forced to become could rest now, too. I was no longer a burden. I was not a branding problem or an asset to be liquidated. I was a historian, surrounded by his archives. I had my past safely stored in 4 boxes, and my future, as blank and open as the unmapped territories on this old chart, was entirely my own to explore. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace.